Welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Austin Chadwick. This is Chris Lucian. And today we're really excited to have David Bernstein with us. And to get us rolling, David, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a software developer and have been for, scary to say, 30 years or so, which I think makes me what they call a two-percenter. There's not many people in our industry that have been in the field for that long. Mm-hmm. I love software development, and I focus on XP practices, which I think is what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into that first topic. I'll move it over. And one thing I know about David is I've spent some time learning a lot from David, and one thing I know is you are very passionate about extreme programming. And so when I think of extreme programming and passion, I think of you. So this is a great topic for today. And maybe tell us a little bit why you're so passionate about extreme programming and its practices.
Well, gosh, like I said, I've been in the field for a long time and predated Agile. So I was a waterfall developer for the first, 10, 15 years of my career. And it was very stressful, as you might be able to tell. Those are just some of the scars that I've had from it. And I wanted to make software development more sustainable. I wanted to figure out if there was a way that it could be better, because it was always like a death march back in those days. And when I got exposed to extreme programming, these things made total sense to me. And suddenly I started to build software in a very different way. And I think it's a very effective way to build software. So that's why I'm very excited about it. I didn't think we would get here within my lifetime. But I think that a lot of people are unaware that we've solved a lot of the problems, the technical problems in software development that we've been living with for so long. And we've been living with it for so long that we don't even recognize them as problems anymore. So I have found that life gets a lot better, and my work gets far better using these practices.
Nice. So so early on, when you were first making a transition into maybe the extreme programming space, like what were some of the first things that you adopted? Like, I know a lot of people are like, okay, well, we need to adopt a lot of practices all at the same time or something along those lines. Like, how did XP come into your life?
Oh, interesting. Actually, it was Chadwick and Scott Bain who kind of brought me into the fold in a lot of ways, and I'm super grateful to them.
Nice.
And I got a chance to really learn about design patterns from them, and worked for them for 3 years almost. And that whole idea of emergent design and design patterns and seeing something a lot deeper in terms of being able to build software in a way that is maintainable. In the old days, I think most of us were kind of focused on just making the computer do something.
Yeah.
That's just sort of straight logic, and it turns out anyone can do that.
Well, the first time anybody gets into it at all, they focus on the hello world, right? Like anything along those lines, make it work, right? Yeah.
Yes. But being able to make software that's maintainable, that is straightforward to extend, requires a whole different skill set.
Yes.
It requires integrative skills. And that is what I found very exciting, because that really engages the creative side of the brain, the intuitive side of the brain, the visualization sides of the brain. And so I'm a guy who's always been fascinated by consciousness. And what is consciousness? How do we think? How do we model the world?
Nice.
In fact, I wanted to be a scientist all my life. As a kid, and even going through college, I wanted to be a scientist. And I kind of fell into software development by accident. Yeah. And I was really good at it, but it always seemed like kind of a toy to me, not very, I didn't really ever take it seriously, even though I had a thriving career in it. And as I started to study design patterns and integration and the ideas of building maintainable software, I started to realize that the things that I was most passionate about, understanding how we think and model the world, is exactly what we do in software. So that got me re-engaged and re-excited, super excited about being in this field for the last over a decade now, very passionate about it. And now what I want to do is I want to share some of those ideas outside of our field, because I feel like there's a lot of people and a lot of disciplines outside of software development that could really benefit from some of our techniques that we've learned of managing complexity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The expansion of complexity, requiring as many various ways of handling that complexity, and you can't go further below, right? The control systems theories type stuff. So yeah, that makes sense.
Nice.
And it's interesting that, you know, we're very dealt with that. We're very comfortable with that, but I think a lot of other disciplines are overwhelmed by it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we started to talk a little bit about extreme programming and what life was like before it. But the world has, you know, largely embraced Agile in a lot of ways, but they'll often do it as, I think as our next topic says, you know, they'll do Agile without some of these technical practices. So maybe let's jump into that topic. So I'm going to move that one over. And, yeah, you got that one? Yeah.
Good.
So, what's your experience? I mean, I know you've seen a lot of companies, you've trained a lot of people, you've coached a lot of companies.
Yes.
What have you kind of seen in the world as far as people embracing Agile, but maybe not the technical practices? How does that work out?
Yeah, and to date now, it's nearly 10,000 professional software developers that I had the opportunity to work with and train. So I think that might even be a world's record. So I really get to see a lot. And I'm talking about like intensive 5-day trainings. I'm not talking about the conferences that I do. I do many conferences every year, which I'm sure is many thousands more people. So I'm very close to the industry. I really see what people are doing. And what I've noticed, and I think most of us know this, is that, you know, the process side has really taken off. Scrum has really become quite popular, and I'm very happy about that. But what I'm not super happy about is that sometimes people think that that's the end. That all they need to do is, you know, have a better planning meeting and boom, everything magically happens. They get great code, but that doesn't usually happen. That doesn't usually work out that way.
Yep. So,
you know, Agile, we say Agile came from the Agile Manifesto. And if we look at the people who were the original authors of the Agile Manifesto, every single one of them is a software developer.
Yep.
So Agile was created by software developers for software developers.
Mm.
And suddenly it became a kind of a management process, a certification process. And I don't think there was any real evil intention behind that. It's just what the market wanted.
Yeah.
You know? I'd love to know your feelings on this too, because you guys are experts on this subject as well.
Well, I can start off with my experience because it was actually related to you, David. I was at a shop where, you know, we embraced Scrum, and we would go through the Agile Manifesto, and I could talk, you know, I'd be bringing new team members on, and I could talk through the manifesto. And when I got to one of the principles about technical excellence, it was just kind of like, oh, and do a good job when we write code, and then moving on. You know what I mean? It didn't have much meat to it, right? You know, and so, and my experience in that was, you know, we saw the problems where we would, you know, sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3, yeah, we're going fast. Sprint 50, whoa, we got lots of bugs and things are going really, really slow, you know, and so I've experienced firsthand what it's like to work on a team that embraces the management practices. And then it was closely related to doing some training with you that I was like, I see all our problems. I see, yeah, and as soon as, you know, I tried the extreme programming practices like test-driven development, refactoring to patterns, pair programming, and mob programming, that I basically saw the light, and it was such an amazing transition. And so I felt the pain and the joys of both worlds. So that's kind of where I'm coming at from this topic, is that I've experienced both sides.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to share, Chris? On that?
So, you know, early on, I kind of realized that, so before knowing about the Agile Manifesto and things along those lines, I basically was looking for better ways to communicate in my teams, and it was a lot of times where like two software developers working together couldn't actually share information between each other no matter how hard they tried, and And so it was fascinating to me, and I think the real value for things, for the technical practices like unit testing and clean code and things along those lines, the value was immediately apparent to me because it was a way to communicate. And so if you look at the Agile Manifesto and you say like individuals and interactions, like you can actually take that to a technical extent. And so what I think was happening was the individuals and interactions might have even been, just like you said, David, meant for the technical side of things. And instead it was interpreted as, better, more talking to each other, better talking to each other. But in reality, I think that a lot of it has to do with just saying like, hey, just be careful. You're going to break the stuff that I worked on if you change that. And having an automatic way of doing that was a form of communication. And so, a unit test is a whole lot better than a Slack message to me. And right. So that was like a really a big eye-opening moment for just the I realized that a lot of those technical practices are communication formats, and it is always better to have that documentation be present within the code rather than somewhere away from the code or abstracted from the code.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so one thing that jumps out to me, David, that I learned from you was kind of going off of the communication via code, is design patterns. How do you, in your mind, design patterns help communication in code? Yeah.
Very much. And so I think there's really two levels for us as developers in design patterns. The notion of patterns in general, which is very, very powerful. It came from Christopher Alexander, who is a physical architect. He builds buildings. And he was obsessed with making buildings more livable. He found if you do these certain things over and over again when you're building a building, it becomes more habitable, more comfortable for people. And he called these things design patterns. Now several fields have discovered and are using design patterns. Software development was one of the very first, given Eric Gamma's doctoral thesis and then their follow-on book, Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. That book is a classic, and it's also hard to read, but really full of great information. So I don't usually refer people to reading the book because I've rarely met a person who understands the book. Even I don't, I've been working with patterns a lot, and I still don't understand the book. But I do understand other books that have been written about patterns. And there are many, many good books now on patterns. So patterns are really about their intent. It's a kind of a different level of abstract thinking. It's sort of meta abstractions. So I really love that. And then these 23 patterns from the Gang of Four really talks about how to think about software modeling in a way that represents reality more closely. Maybe that's a great way to think of it. So to me, they are like my home vocabulary. I now feel like English is my second language because I think in patterns so much now.
Nice.
Yeah, and one great thing after learning how to understand patterns and how to code them and apply them to appropriate problems and not overuse them, but they are such a great communication tool. So instead of having to explain like, oh, what this is doing, and then give this like long paragraph explanation, it's like, oh, this is an adapter. And more often than not, as we talk in patterns, you don't have to explain what's going on. Oh, this is an adapter, and this is a strategy for several different situations, and this factory will give you different strategies depending on what you need. And it really just highly accelerates communication. So I'm basically going back to you and saying, what you said in your class has turned out to be true. So thank you.
Oh, good. And that's from understanding the patterns as intent.
Yes.
What I see very often people do is they think that the UML is the pattern. So they look at what Gang of Four calls canonical UML diagram and say, oh, that's the pattern. But that's like trying to say a picture of something is really the thing. It's not. It's just one representation. So having that deeper, richer understanding of what a pattern is, and knowing that there are many ways to fulfill that intent, and that there are many outcomes from applying that intent, can really help us understand better and communicate better. It's not just communicating with each other; it's communicating within our own brains. That I find that there's a great deal of value with patterns. because they help me, again, understand things at a much higher level of abstraction. And that is allowing us to see the forest for the trees, really.
Nice.
Awesome.
Yeah, and the intent is something I've came to experience too. I think it was just the other day, we were factoring and we came to a place and I'm like, this is the intent of the bridge pattern, and I've never done it before in code. And then I went and looked up the UML or the code, and it wasn't quite the same, but as you said, it was the same intent. And so it was, so I found that very helpful distinction, right? Yeah, as opposed to, it's not the code that you look up when you open up the Gang of Four book, the example.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess transitioning to our last topic, which is how to help the industry with technical practices. So we've kind of talked about how these technical practices, we've experienced a lot of benefit from them. Your book, which we'll plug later, goes into a lot of detail on the statistics on how these technical practices reduce bugs, increase productivity, and these kinds of things. But now getting to how do we help the industry move in the right direction in regards to these things?
Yeah, well, first of all, valuing them, recognizing that this is a technical field. The way I like to put it is, Agile software development does have something to do with software development. And so we do have to pay attention to, some of those practices as well. And I really feel like we in the Agile movement are really on the leading edge. Every once in a while sort of look back and see what other people are doing in software development. There's you're familiar with PMBOK, that's for project management. There's a software, I don't know how to pronounce it, software development, sort of specification. And it makes no sense to me at all. It's like, the people who wrote it, did they ever write a program? In a professional context. So the things that I see happening from you guys, from the other colleagues in our industry, are really addressing the issues. And because it costs 5 times more to maintain code after it's released than it cost originally to write it, this is from an NIST study, we have to figure out how to make our software more changeable. This is an issue that we in our industry really have never addressed directly. It was always about make it work. Mm-hmm. Working. But not after it's working, how do you deal with it? How do you extend it? And that's why we're paying such a huge price for extending software. So understanding some of just the very, very basics. Steve McConnell sometimes says that what he notices as industry best practices are in fact worst practices. And I see this a lot. I see a lot of people doing practices that we were taught in school that actually impede, extensibility, maintainability, testability, things like that.
Speaking of
what
classes,
are some of the... Sorry?
One thing that was really funny, just as a side note, I took a master's course, 2012, 2013, somewhere around there. And one thing that I found was interesting was they actually had a design patterns class. And so I went and took that. And it used the Gang of Four book, and so, but it was fascinating because it was just information that I felt like they should have been teaching to the undergrads, and I was very confused as why at all would it have been a graduate level course in the first place, and so I just found that fascinating. But it was good.
You're lucky because most colleges and schools don't even have any design patterns courses at any level. And there's only a few that I know of that have anything to do with Agile.
Yeah.
Well, so they're teaching people things, information, knowledge that's 20 years old. That's not being done really in industry, at least in the top companies. Yeah. And so people are going to school, they're learning bad habits, and then they're having to come out and unlearn those bad habits to learn good habits.
Oh yeah.
And if Uncle Bob Martin is right, and our industry is doubling every 5 years and has for the last 30 years, that means the average level of experience on the team is 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the blind leading the blind.
Yeah. I like it. Yeah, and it's funny. So we have a heavy focus on just engaging with the community, and so we've been working a lot with the local university here and they're doing things like mob programming and test-driven stuff in there and stuff like that. So it's like if there are companies out there that are doing a lot of extreme programming style stuff or just agile related stuff, one thing that I think the industry really could use is industry professionals engaging with those universities to and finding professors that are interested in exploring those areas and expanding that.
Yes.
And so it's my belief that every organization should have some level of community education involvement for the industries that they're in, regardless of industry. So
Yes.
yeah.
I fully agree. And thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
You know, some of the best companies do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's amazing what level kids can even start to pick it up. So, we recently were involved in an event where middle schoolers who had learned to code were brought in, and we did test-driven development mob-style kata with them. And I've even heard people say, like, I wish we could hire them because they're better than people some of them are better than people we find out, in the regular market for entry or something like that. And so
just education and lack of information, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
And so,
yes, I've met new hires that I would put against any developer at any level.
Yeah.
Some people are just born, that way, or just have that aptitude, I guess.
Sure, yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with exposure, and so all I'm getting at is like if we can expose people to unit testing earlier on, then they might not get so ingrained in the way of doing things. A long time ago, I had a professor tell me that unit testing was for people who didn't know how to program and things like that. And so it's like just breaking
cowboy
that.
ethic in our industry is it's gotta go, and it's not serving us,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
making life miserable for so many people.
Absolutely.
But we are like, we're developers, we're gonna bite the bullet, we're originally in waterfall, it was figure it all out up front and then implement it and then verify it, right? And now we're doing Agile where we don't get all of our requirements up front. And yet we still are taking, as developers, the same mental process as if we could predict the right design up front without having all the requirements.
Yeah.
And then, goodness gracious, we get it wrong, right? Of course we would get it wrong. No one could get it right.
Yeah.
But then we don't know how to take our old design that was inadequate and refactor it to something better.
Yeah.
It turns out, though, that it's really easy for the most part to do this. Not the time, but most of the time, changing your designs is pretty straightforward. So I like to say it doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you end.
Yeah.
And the very best developers I know are really willing to change their minds, change their design. The other thing, I love that you mentioned this, Chris, is because you were asking, how do we sort of level up and how do we get a higher level of technical excellence? I think we are still figuring out what is important and what is unimportant in terms of what we're developing. And one of the things that I have discovered, and I think many others have discovered, is really important for the extensibility of software is its testability.
Mm-hmm.
This is a sort of a missing virtue. And when I say testability, I mean the ability to validate and verify at the smallest level code, so that if your test fails, it fails for only a single reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
One of my heroes, Nisco Havery, says, I rarely meet a developer who knows how to write a good test. And I think that's true. I don't meet a lot of developers who know, and we assume that we do, right? Because, hey, it's a test, right? But it turns out that there's a lot of subtlety in being able to write good tests.
Yes.
And when we write tests against behavior, which is what we're supposed to be doing when we're doing TDD, that supports us in being able to refactor our code, changing the internal design without changing its actual behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I call these behavioral tests, and that's the kind of test we want to do at TDD because it supports us in making late changes to our code.
Yeah.
We still might need to write other tests to validate and feel comfortable that things are working. But in TDD, it's a very different mindset. Just like when you're writing versus editing, there's a different mindset that you have. I know this because now I'm a writer, right? Which, by the way, since we're talking about plugging,
Yes, go ahead.
this book is called Beyond Legacy Code. And it's really about the technical practices and why they're important.
There's a picture of us in there too.
Yes, there is. Let's see if I can find it.
Yeah.
You're prominent in it, Chris.
Yeah, there we go. I was
I'm leafing through it, seeing if I can. This is the C3 project. That's not.
There you go.
There's only 2 pictures in the book.
Yeah, it'll be very hard for our YouTube audience to actually see that.
That's true.
But
I should show you this too. I just got this last week. This is the Japanese version.
Nice.
This came out. And today, someone sent me a picture of the Chinese version.
Nice. Yeah. I saw that. I keep in touch with a lot of people in Tokyo, and so I had seen the Japanese translation, and I think the Chinese translation picture too. Yeah. Very cool. That's awesome.
Nice.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think of it as not a how-to book, but a why-to book. Why we're doing these practices, so that managers and executives can get on the same page with development. So this is a book that everyone can read. It's a book that is valuable to developers, but it's also valuable to give to your executives and managers.
Nice.
To explain why we do these practices.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can testify to the a lot of the things you kind of learn and then you try out, and testing to the behavior is a big one that's been a real growth for me over the last couple of years, because when you test, you kind of have the classical unit test in mind, where it's like every method has a test and it's very implementation specific. I've seen what that looks like, right? You get a lot of fragile tests, right? And
yes, exactly.
And
it actually impedes refactoring rather than
yes.
supporting refactoring.
Yes, you go to refactor and you break 50 tests, right? And so,
right.
And I also wanted to say too, we were mobbing the other day, and what you're saying about having testable code is so true. The code didn't necessarily have a lot of the virtues that you talk about in your book or in extreme programming, but it did have the D in solid, where dependencies were separated and it was very testable. So we were able to switch a test to a more behavior-specific test, and it was very easy to isolate or use the real thing. And so it was so awesome because it was made testable. We could easily, switch to a more behavior style of testing or refactor it much easier. So, so even if you make other mistakes in coding, making it testable has so many wins for maintainability. So
I so agree.
Yeah,
I so agree. It just, if that's the one thing, if you're only going to focus on one thing, that's the one thing to focus.
Yeah, because in the experience I was comparing it with was I did the same thing in another shop, and to write one unit test caused 5 million compiler errors, it felt like, because the code wasn't written in a testable way. And so it was nearly impossible to isolate any piece of code from anything else. And so so I've been feeling what you've been preaching. So
Right on.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So I guess we're getting close to time. You've shared with us your book. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we close it out, David?
Just one thing, actually. Just another interesting observation about our industry, and I think you guys sort of exemplify it, which is that although we're a highly intellectual field, I find that the people in our field are deeply compassionate and really kind. I really don't see this in other industries so much, but especially the people who are really successful, who are sharing information, there's a great deal of kindness in our industry. I think it actually goes hand in hand with intelligence. And this is the thing that gets me pretty excited about life, because I think the smarter we get, the kinder we get as well.
I like
That's my experience with you guys, especially.
All right.
So what's one of our lofty goals? Kindness, consideration, respect. Yeah. So it's something that's we definitely value, but we're always growing in because it's easy to mess up. But it takes conscious effort, right?
Yeah.
So. But I think teams can become more effective for sure if they treat each other that way, right? And absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's a good way to end it with on kindness. And you want to close this out, Chris?
Yeah. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, David, and just make sure that everybody likes, subscribes. If you feel like there's somebody out there that really could use the content in this video, please share it with them, because I think that a lot of the circulation of information is going to really help us get things going in the industry, and make sure that those people that go into the industry today won't make the same mistakes that we did when we were entering the industry.
Yeah, really.
Yes.
Another act of compassion.
Yep.
And by the way, this is also what I do. I teach, so I have 5-day workshops, and as you see, I wrote a book and stuff like that. So if I can assist, or if anybody wants to chat with me about any of these ideas, I'd love to do that. You can reach me through my website, tobeagile.com, TOBE.
And we'll put a link in the description as well.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, cool. Right
All
on.
right.
Right on.
Thank you very much,
Thanks, guys.
everybody. Bye.